throughout human history, people have had ways of developing narratives that have enabled them to cooperate, that have enabled them to trust each other, that have enabled them to form community. Those techniques sometimes don't show up on our radar as technology, but this is really just kind of a semantic issue, right? Maybe we should broaden our attention beyond the category of things that we traditionally think of as technology. We do need to get better at that.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Edge City podcast. My name is Timour, and we're using this series to explore the ideas and projects that are pushing at the edges of tech, science, and culture. By the end of every episode, you'll have a clear understanding of the important idea that's set to shape our society in the years to come. Today, I was joined by Matt Prewitt, who's the president of the RadicalxChange Foundation. This was a very interesting discussion. Matt and some of his colleagues at RadicalxChange, like Glenn Weil and others, have thought deeply about what it will actually take to reimagine some of society's fundamental systems. So we talk a lot about that. We touch on social technologies and why innovating there is just as important as in software and hardware, which is what we typically focus on, at least in tech. And we'll dive into some of the experiments that we're running with RadicalxChange at Edge City to put some of their ideas into practice. So with that, let's get into the show. Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here. Great to talk to you.
So what I'd like to do here is to ladder up to a couple of core ideas using some of the essays that you've written as scaffolding. And we'll start with some of the ideas around new community and society movements, then touch on the idea of social technology and why it's so interesting and important in our world today. And then I'd love to get into some of the money systems, things that you've talked about, community currencies, plural money, which I feel like are interesting examples of some of this kind of experimentation. But I think a good place to set the scene is with you introducing RadicalxChange. And in particular, I'd love to know the mission of the organization, and then what is your theory of change for how you will achieve that goal?
Sure. RadicalxChange is a small nonprofit. We also try to coordinate a larger movement and a network of people around the world who are sort of fellow travelers. We started in really properly in 2019, organizing communities of people who had read and were captivated by some of the ideas in the book Radical Markets by Glenn Weil and Eric Posner. The ideas in that book suggested really radical, provocative reforms to the way that we vote, the way that we own property, the way that we own data, and more. And that has set the template for RadicalxChange's work and mission since then. We take a deep look at the basic institutions of democracy and markets. So we think about what are the rails on which our democratic decisions are taking place. What are the fundamental building blocks of the powers and the transactions that constitute a market? And how can we improve those institutions? So sort of like, a little bit, nothing is sacred, right? I mean, can we do ownership better? The way that we vote, could it make more sense? Could it capture more information? Could it help us lead to decisions that better satisfy the population? Could it incorporate more deliberation? We try to ask these basic questions. We try to come up with proposals of improving things rationally, responsibly, in accordance with certain values like quality and dignity and, sort of some of these kind of high level things that probably underlie, most people's conception of what a good society should look like. And our theory of change is to, first of all, it has to be said that we're working sort of pretty far up the lever, if you will, of change, right? We're definitely thinking about fundamental issues and big changes to society. So part of the theory is influencing ideas, inspiring people to think deeply about some of these basic institutions that we might be able to improve. And I think part of the theory is also that by working with, forward-thinking sort of institutionalists in government and elsewhere, but also very importantly, working with like technologists who are building systems that might constitute the next generation of institutions in various ways. that we can help build a culture of experimentation and institutional improvement that develops in institutions and in the world of technology, and helps us get to a world in which democratic institutions work better and economies work better for more people, and so on.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think parts of the reason that Radical Markets, the book, was so interesting to so many people was that, like you said, it is kind of orthogonal to traditional ideas of left and right. I think there are a lot of folks who are on really both sides of the spectrum who really liked some of the ideas. And I think they were able to thread the needle, kind of not attacking, but really poking at some of these things that have felt too big to criticize, like markets or the idea of like ownership of private property, etc. So yeah, I think that's just like very appealing to a lot of people. The ideas in that book and some of the things that have developed from it have been very well discussed on your podcast and others. So maybe I'll add some links to those, and we won't go too much into, quadratic voting, etc. But folks can catch up on that if they want to. I would like to focus on a great essay that you wrote called Secret Societies, Network States, Burning Man, Zuzalu, and More, Thoughts on New Political Communities. And I think some of the ideas in this piece really offer a good framework for understanding new society type projects. So yeah, I'd love to ask you a little bit about that. And to kick off, you start the essay by referencing a sociologist called Georg Simmel. I'm curious what you learned from Simmel and what insight he has into identity and community.
Yeah. Simmel was kind of one of the founders of sociology. He was a German sociologist in the same generation, roughly, as like Weber and Durkheim, the other kind of well-known founders of sociology. He was interested in sort of networks of relationships and formation of group identities and things like that, among many other things. I mean, he had really wide-ranging interests. But one of the things that I find quite interesting about Simmel is that he has this really elegant description of the way that information sort of serves as a substrate for relationships. So in particular, sort of informational boundaries and secrets. So I think there's just a huge amount of richness in his analysis of the role that secrecy plays in relationships. And in some ways, this is obvious. Like in most good friendships, there are things that the friends know that nobody else knows. In every marriage, for example, there are things that the partners know that nobody else knows. So in other words, there's shared information between the two parties to relationships, and then there's a informational boundary around the relationship, so that shared information is not known outside of the relationship. This phenomenon can also happen in larger groups. It doesn't just have to be one-to-one pairs. So there's this idea of common knowledge, which is the idea that when I know something, and I know that you know that thing, and I know that you know that I know that you know, and so on. This enables really, really powerful forms of coordination. So we can just be really confident in the fact that we share context, that we share actionable knowledge, so we can act together. This goes on in relationships, and in really important ways. It constitutes communities, right? So there's the fact of the common knowledge shared by the community, and there's also the fact that knowledge is not shared inside the community. And the important thing I think to see is that you need both of those. So if you sort of lose the uniqueness of information, then the community stops being a community. Its boundaries move. If that unique information that constitutes the community is leaked to people who don't have the community's best interests in mind, then communities can be manipulable, for example, from the outside. There's kind of an infinite amount to say about this, so I won't go on too long, but Simmel has a really elegant, rich analysis of all the different permutations of these kinds of informational boundaries and how they constitute communities. Can I just give one more example?
Yeah.
All right. So I think one really beautiful example that I think helps land some of this abstraction is that in like ancient Druid culture, so like a Celtic pagan culture or whatever, initiates to like the priestly class where they would memorize songs. They had to memorize these like sacred songs, and they would learn the sacred songs from the older generation. And there was a prohibition, like a taboo, on writing down the songs. So it could not be written down. It had to be just like transmitted orally and then remembered and then passed on again. What Simmel's analysis helps show is that secrecy of the songs is it's not just about the content of the songs. It's not just about making sure that nobody knows the, secret spiritual text or something outside of the clique. It's also about firming up the relationship between the older generation and the younger generation. If the songs had been written down, if they were, public, if they were, carved into stone tablets and, put up on the wall for everybody to see, then the younger generation wouldn't depend on the older generation in the same way. They wouldn't have this experience of transmission from the older generation. They wouldn't see the older generation as having sort of a privileged place in society because they could just study the songs themselves and ignore what the older generation was saying. So it's like that what Simmel really beautifully drives home is that transmission is the point of the secrecy, that sort of use of the information as a medium that helps constitute the social connection between generations and, within the Druidic priestly class. That's the whole thing. That's what's going on. And understanding the powerful role that information should play. It's interesting for all kinds of things when we talk about, forming healthy communities and so on. And it's also interesting from a technological point of view because a lot of stuff that's, going on with, let's say, cryptography and with AI and with, use of data, it all bears upon this. It all bears upon our ability to construct, like an informational landscape in which common, unique knowledge is present and is serving that binding role in communities.
Yeah. Like, I think there's an important idea there of secrets or shared knowledge, not just being a byproduct of relationships and communities, but they're actually core to the process of communities forming. And I think we see this a lot with shared memes, shared culture, shared language even. Like you can just tell when someone uses certain types of slang or just by the way that people talk, that they're really part of a certain group. You can like very quickly identify with them and share a connection there. There's something interesting that's almost the opposite of what you're saying, where like each generation, for example, develops their own way of speaking and are able to very easily, you can very easily see online who is like Gen Z coded just by the way they interact. And so that's almost their own way of identity formation and difference from the other generations. But yeah, I think in terms of some of the communities that we're thinking about and talking about, this idea of shared knowledge is actually very important. And the strength of those memes and the strength of almost the shared memories that you have, right? Like you go through experiences together and then that is itself secret knowledge because you have that memory with the people that were there.
Right.
It could be, like you were saying before we started recording, like 40,000 people at the final Oakland A's game. Or it could be, something that you and your partner do together. But those memories are also their own form of shared knowledge, or secret knowledge, which is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually, you can start to see the richness of Simmel's analysis because it, in a way, that shows the power of like in-person experiences because the sort of the full complement of information that passes between people when they're present in person can't be captured and it can't be shared. So therefore you have this sort of built-in secrecy envelope. I mean, I think that really is like a big part of the social role that presence plays.
I think that's a big part of the Edge City thesis in many ways. We'll touch on that a little bit. So in the piece, you outlined 3 types of new community initiatives. And I wonder if we could just walk through some of these and some of their benefits and potential pitfalls. So maybe just go through them one by one.
Sure. So in this piece, I'm talking about sort of different flavors of intentional communities, if you will, which is already, let's say, distinct from, unintentional communities, right? There are inherited communities, things that we find pre-made, but the project of creating new communities and enhancing old communities is very important. And so that's what I'm analyzing here. And I'm thinking about, so in the context of intentional communities, roughly, let's say there's 3 kinds. One might be affinity communities. So what that is like, if you want to be with people who are more like you, basically, who think like you, or who indeed look like you, or whatever, right? If you want to be sort of like more surrounded by similarity, these are affinity communities. Obviously, there's a big dark side to that one, but it's not always the worst thing in the world, right? Sometimes, you can have a knitting club. Now, basically, many intentional communities, I think, are one form or another of this, right? It's people who think that, the world is full of wrong thinking people. Let's find some of the right thinking people and get them together so that we can hang out. Then there's the second category is individualist escapers. What this is I would say people who are in a way resisting the structures of community or the structures of connection that they find in the world around them or in the societies that they're already in. So, this is a libertarian impulse, basically, right? You don't like taxes, you don't like local government, you don't like the whatever, this, that, or the other thing. You feel that you can do everything better from scratch and that you don't need to be embedded in pre-existing structure to thrive. A lot of people feel this way. And, some of them move to Montana in a cabin. But some of them also like end up kind of clustering or forming networks with other people who sort of think in that individualist escaper sort of a way, right? So, preppers, bunker builders, tax havens, right? There's a whole genre of intentional escape and quasi community out there. And I think that this kind of community is like a little bit paradoxical or a little bit oxymoronic because it's like anti-community community. And I think a lot of these kinds of projects sort of founder because of that internal tension in what they're trying to do. They're trying to build communities that aren't communities. They're against community and they're trying to form, connection with other people who are against community. So it's like an uphill battle. And I think a lot of these kinds of projects, they can be impactful, but that impact is not necessarily the formation of like a lasting, healthy community. Sometimes the impact is just sort of allowing individuals to, go off in their own direction. Sometimes the impact might be kind of eroding or drawing energy away from like escaped from communities, these kinds of things. And
well, I think just on that one, I think you make a great point, which is escapist projects are legitimate to the extent that the thing they're escaping from is worth escape from.
Yeah.
Right. So if people are leaving, like a truly oppressive place, that's great. But right, when they try and leave something purely with the idea of like exit and they form like an anti-community, it's hard for that to get traction, or it can be hard. But, it'll be interesting to see, because I feel like there are some current experiments that run along those lines that are more like libertarian leaning, and it'll be interesting to see how they go.
Yeah, totally. Underline that. That's an incredibly, I sort of forgot, sometimes I forget to tell half the story, but that's absolutely right. Like in a way, this is a big part of the story of modernity. Many people pre-modernity were trapped within oppressive communities, and modernity enabled more individualistic modes of living together that enabled people to escape from or ease the burden of those oppressive attachments. And that's a good thing if those pre-existing attachments are oppressive and harmful, and it can be a bad thing too. It can become sort of a bridge to nowhere, or an erosion of things that we don't want to erode when it kind of goes too far, or when it pulls energy away from communities that are not like on the whole bad.
All right, and the third.
So with the third category of what I call in the essay responsible experimenters, what I'm really trying to do is to sort of suggest a middle path between these other two. So the sort of affinity community thing and the individualist escape thing, they both have kind of dark sides and light sides, but ultimately, for the best kind of new community initiatives, it's important to hold both of those things lightly, to basically not index too hard on creating affinity communities or creating escape communities. Both of those are ultimately kind of shaky ground in my view, even though they're not necessarily all bad. And I think that the sort of substrate for community experiments that most interest me is a little bit popping up to one level of abstraction higher, which is, thinking about like, what would it mean to be able to create healthy communities that are a little bit agnostic to whether we're bound by this affinity or that affinity, or a little bit agnostic to the sort of notion of escape from the old world, right? Maybe we can just come up with ways of living together that work better and that provide us meaning, that are not fully grounded in affinity or escape, or at least are sort of holding affinity and escape a bit light. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. For example, I think the kibbutz movement is a really interesting example of fairly successful intentional community building. Now, look, there was obviously pretty strong affinity thing there. That probably played an important role in its success. Nonetheless, there's something to learn, right? I mean, to put it bluntly, they did a pretty good job, like, not becoming cults. So one of the big failure modes for like back to the land potential communities is that they become like authoritarian cults of one kind or another. I'm sure that happened at some kibbutzes too, but a lot of kibbutzim like did a fairly good job organizing themselves along the lines of democratic governance and shared governance, and making their contribution to the like the sort of shared economy of the kibbutz the center of their communal life, as opposed to making some like eccentric ideological or spiritual project the center of their communal life. And because of that, they were incredibly successful, and they were the center of successful lives for many people. Now, a lot of them didn't last more than a couple of generations, but so what? They did a great thing for many people. Similar stories to tell about many other movements. That's an interesting one.
Yeah. I wonder if affinity or creating communities of affinity is the issue when the affinity is for one core thing at the expense of everything else, or one or two things are very important. And that can often become a person as well. And that's kind of the cult failure mode. And that's a relatively common thing. When you have just one key thing, I feel like that can become dangerous because everything becomes about that.
Yeah.
I feel like there are groups of affinity, for example, sports fans, where yes, they are linked by their team, but that's not the entirety of their life, right? Whereas if you move to a separate piece of land with 1,000 people and it's the Oakland A's renegade, community that doesn't accept the fact that they just moved to Las Vegas, that can quickly spiral out of control because people are just very dynamic. They're very, identity is very plural, right? There are many aspects of people, and that I feel like is often something that happens in these environments. Whereas if you, for example, started community project or kind of a new society project for an affinity, but it was more about ways of being, for example, curious, kind, people who are building stuff, which is what we focus on at Edge City. Maybe this is just naive hope and optimism, but maybe that can work out better because there isn't like a core commandment. There is just a way of being as a person, as a way of showing up almost.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Communities, seems to me, that new communities or intentional communities that go well have a way of making space for different interpretations of what's going on there. So it's actually kind of a beautiful illustration of like plurality. I think that it, just as you say, it can really go wrong if there's sort of, if we're over indexing on, the spiritual teaching of Guru X or a particular mission for which we will sacrifice our everything in our lives. It gets dark. I mean, these things get dark. Where it doesn't get dark is where you've got loosely shared alignment, where people can show up there and have reasonably different ideas of what in fact is going on there, and that's okay. That you're not sort of being policed into like a tightly aligned interpretation of the project.
Just a quick tangent for folks who are not familiar with the idea of plurality. Could you just help define that briefly?
Sure. Can I define it briefly? That's a great question. I mean, drawing from a different context here, which is the idea of plurality as a counterpoint to techno-authoritarianism or corporate libertarianism. So you can think of a few other 21st century ideologies out there that are that we might sort of point to and name in a broader political sense. And the idea of plurality has to do with, instead of embracing sort of like hardcore technocracy or hardcore corporate libertarianism, can we find sort of a middle path in democratic institutions and an instruction of digital worlds that enables democracy to continue to hold differences in society? So, I mean, there's a lot to say about that, and a lot, many of my colleagues have written elsewhere about plurality, but that's what I'm referencing here when I say, I think that that kind of vision of communities in which people can diverge a little bit in their interpretation of what's happening in the community, what the community's for, and what its norms are. You can kind of picture that in your mind, and it's actually a pretty good illustration of what this writing about plurality is trying to point to, I think.
Mm-hmm. So you make a compelling argument in the piece about the importance of something you call social technology. And this is something we talk about a lot at Edge City, and we're actually trying to figure out how to define it ourselves. I'm curious what that means for you. And I think you say something like techniques of deepening and expanding communities, like why this type of work is actually as important potentially as what we normally think of as like technological advancement.
Yeah. One piece of background here is, I think that when we talk about community, a lot of times what we're really talking about is story. What we're really talking about is narrative. And I think many of us sense the ways in which the sort of narratives that underlie our communities are threatened or are fraying. Sometimes because of technology, sometimes for reasons that have nothing to do with technology. But as technologists, when we think about solving this problem, I mean, there's a very Silicon Valley way of framing things, which is like, what problem are you working on, right? If you think of things as a problem, sometimes that framing doesn't quite leave room for this idea that what we really need is not solution, but story or narrative. And that, I think that's kind of what I'm pointing towards with the idea of social technology. Throughout human history, people have had ways of developing narratives that have enabled them to cooperate, that have enabled them to trust each other, that have enabled them to form community. Those techniques sometimes don't show up on our radar as technology, but this is really just kind of a semantic issue, right? I think we do need to get better at that. There's another side of this argument which says that basically we already have all the communities that we need. We like our social technologies, the sort of substrate that binds us together, the narratives that give our lives meaning, that enable us to function as communities and trust each other. All those are from the past. So we can just we just take them, or we can retrench into them. I don't think that's quite right. I think there's some truth to that, but we also need to get better at building these things. We also need to a little bit accept that there's a technology-ish problem that we need to be paying attention to, which is how to get better at building these things, how to get better at repairing social fabric, how to get better at discerning and developing and interpreting narratives that enable us to build new communities that sustain us socially and economically and culturally.
So essentially what you're saying is, just like we're spending a lot of effort on creating software and hardware, we should also be thinking about how do we develop narratives and use those as a technology for creating meaningful communities, like, helping people live, essentially. Like how should we be living our lives in this new world, that kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. And this is one of the reasons why I really love the Edge City project and the pop-up cities movement, because I really see this as a powerful social technology initiative. And, you feel free to sort of disagree with me or to, share your own interpretation of it. But the way I see it is that you are inviting people into a container in which a story can be built, in which a narrative can be constructed, a narrative that then becomes the basis of a community that supports people, that makes people's lives better. If successful, that narrative will have some very interesting qualities, right? It'll be a very 21st century narrative, a narrative that is in important and interesting and impressive ways, a kind of built without deep dependence on historical narratives. That's interesting. Not like, I don't think, again, I'm not knocking historical narratives, but as the world gets faster and more connected and more complicated, the historical narratives run into limits. They start clashing with each other, and if they aren't giving us everything we need. So we need to create some new stories and social substrates that are based on other things too. And in my interpretation of the pop-up cities movement, that's part of what's going on.
Very interesting. Yeah. It's almost like these environments become incubators of new stories, kind of new ideas about how to live or how to live well, how to, build products and institutions and technologies and etc. It's definitely something we're thinking a lot about. Just one more thing on that. Is there an example we can think of a narrative, either that we could almost like make up just to like really help ground this? So like a potential narrative that gets formed at Edge City is XYZ, or even an example from the past of like a narrative that was created and then had a big impact on things in the way that, yeah, as big an impact as like a new technology or something.
Yeah. I mean, so examples from the past are pretty easy. Like you can just look to the founding myth of any like nation, I mean, America, a wonderful new continent where you can be free. Germany, a region in the middle of Europe with, where people speak closely related dialects and
Yeah.
like the,
or ideas in like the Enlightenment, I guess.
Yeah. Like
the French Revolution.
Yeah, the Enlightenment is, religions are there, Catholicism, Hinduism, right? These are all big narratives, big stories,
big social technologies, essentially. So
huge.
So when you say social technology, it's essentially bundles of ideas that give impulse to people to live and act in certain ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think another layer of it may be useful to point to is like, I mean, I think you all know Harari, kind of gets something right here. The idea that the creation of shared stories through religions and otherwise, basically it enables strangers to trust each other. Like that's kind of that's one of the most important things that it does. So for example, if you and I discover that we are the same religion, that we believe in the same religious propositions, that is like a faster route to us trusting each other, even though we don't otherwise know each other, than almost anything else, right? Like I could, if you were a devout Christian and I was a devout Christian, I could probably, through various kinds of shibboleths and winks and nods, convince you that I too was a devout Christian, like with much greater ease than, convincing you in other ways that you could rely on my behavior or trust me. It's like a very fast path to trust between strangers. And that's what makes it so powerful. That's what makes it so powerful. And that's what, it's a social technology, and it's something that, I mean, and the reason why it isn't that much of a stretch to use the word technology there is that it's like something that makes the human species unique. Animals can't do this the way we can. And it's one of the reasons why human beings are able to collaborate at massive scale.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool, that's helpful. So you touch on several factors that connect communities, and it would be interesting to go into a few of these. So you talk about associative obligations, you touch on John Dewey, which would be awesome to hear about, and then mutual vulnerability. And I think that will set us up really well for the conversation around money.
Sure. So here what I'm talking about are sort of different lenses on connective tissue, different kinds of things that connect communities. Associative obligations are an idea connected to sort of moral philosophy. What it boils down to is that the idea that we have moral obligations to one another in virtue of the way that we associate, in virtue of the way that we're socially connected. So, for example, if you are a son or a daughter, then you may have duties to your parents in virtue of being a son or a daughter. If you're a friend, you may have duties to your friend in virtue of being a friend. If you are a citizen, you may have duties in virtue of being a citizen. So if you take these kinds of moral obligations seriously, then that's like one way of understanding what that kind of connective tissue is in a social group. But the American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey has another interesting kind of way of looking at what a public is. It's a little different from a community. Like these are all sort of slightly askew ideas, but Dewey's concept of a public is an interesting one. So here's what it is. Dewey noticed that in modernity. So he was like writing in the early 20th century and, was kind of witnessing in his life, like the disruptions of the industrial age and all that. So he noticed that in modernity, problems would arise from large scale industrial or economic activity, for example, that cut across traditional communities, and so the traditional communities might be things where we have associative obligations. Like, I don't know. If I'm part of the Jewish community of the Lower East Side of Manhattan in the 1915 or something, I might have associative obligations as a member of that community, right? And then there might be a bunch of other, like, let's say, ethnic communities in Lower Manhattan. Dewey's point is that if a factory starts polluting the entirety of Manhattan, then that problem cuts across these other traditional communities and calls forth a new community in response to the problem. So Dewey had this idea of like publics, like democratic publics, as emerging in response to the problems of modernity. And he dedicated a lot of his thought to education, because he thought that basically like public education, mass education, was critical to giving people the tools to be able to see themselves as members of these emerging communities and cooperate as members of these emerging communities or emergent publics, to deal with the problems of modernity. So that's the idea of like the Deweyan public. It's a public that cuts across other axes and is called forth in response to a problem. It's a very important idea for thinking about modern democracy.
I think this is a very interesting idea, especially now, because it strikes me that in the past, the tools that these publics had were quite limited. So, for example, if we think about all of the people that live along a long river, right, they might be across 5 different nation states, right, in the Amazon or whatever. But really, those people all have a shared, not necessarily a problem, but a shared interest or project, let's say, around this resource that they live close to. But there's really no way for them to collaborate. They live across different nation states. They have limited amounts of democratic power or potentially none. And it seems that now, with some of the things that have been happening in the blockchain space and in general with plurality adjacent technologies, there are much easier ways for people to first be able to identify that they are part of a public and have some shared identity or goal with other folks, and then to actually be able to instantiate some form of action that they can take together. So resource management on a blockchain, for example, they can spin up a wallet, they can add resources to it, they can have voting rights, they can use quadratic voting to make decisions, etc. So I think we just have a lot more surface area to play with some of these ideas. We can just have a much more, not only higher bandwidth democracy, but much more I guess plural is literally the best word, right? Like a much more plural democracy where we're each part of different publics to varying degrees. We care about them differently, but we can be part of 50, I think that's something very interesting there.
Yeah, completely agree. And there's also interesting challenges to it, like, I think maybe the biggest challenge to this sort of plurality view of democracy, I think, is the challenge of mental bandwidth, basically.
Yeah.
Because, it's not easy for people to, every community needs a story. And how many stories can we hold in our heads? This is a real like puzzle. And corollary question to that is like, can we build technologies that help us hold more stories, that help us participate in overlapping democratic processes? You can sort of see here the problem of social technology coming into tighter focus, right? It's like, can we get better at creating stories? Can we get better at understanding, interpreting stories? Can we get better at squaring conflicting stories? Can we get better at participating in community on the basis of conflicting stories and, building, for example, maybe voting systems that enable us to participate in all this complexity? It all sounds pretty complicated, and it is pretty complicated, but it's sort of like, this is where you can sort of see the world pointing us. And if we can't figure out how to deal with this complexity in a democratic way, then one can imagine democracy simply throwing up its arms. And so that's the worry, and that's the like the sort of gauntlet laid down for all this social technology work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. For a lot of us, our experience of democracy is, performing an action once every 4 years, and then to varying degrees talking about the system, but really worrying about other things 99% of the time. And so introducing some of these ideas around having more agency over the varying publics that we are naturally a part of, the varying communities we're in. And I think with stories, I think you're right in terms of the capacity that we have for having different stories in our heads. But do think that just at a macro level, certain stories are shifting in importance. Definitely with religion, that's been a big factor of being much less important for people. I think for a lot of people, nationalism is less important, certainly than, 100 years ago,
Right.
but even more so in my lifetime, something I've noticed, maybe that's just me. I've, grown up all over and kind of certainly, I don't have any like necessarily a link to a certain place.
Right.
So yeah, maybe some of these new network society type communities can start to take place of those stories. And they are the stories that we choose to participate in versus the ones kind of given to us by where we're born or, the religion of our parents, etc. So maybe there's some agency there that's actually quite exciting and interesting.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the other way to think about it is that, I mean, stories they're not in isolation. They're also like in dialogue with each other. So for example, I've got too many stories, I'm American, I'm from the Bay Area, and, I'm the ultimate sort of like modern person mess of a bunch of weak stories. And there's a lot of people like me. The challenge is, can we work with these weak stories and make them all mean a little bit more so that they kind of add up to something, where we feel our lives like, we feel we're working for things larger than ourselves, basically.
Yeah.
Or do we need other stories that connect them, right? So I think a lot of times when we're trying to create new communities, what we're trying to do is also layer in other stories, integrate other ones.
Yeah.
Anyway.
If you had to, just out of curiosity, if you had to say just like, okay, the most important or the 2-3 most important stories to me in my life are XYZ, like how would you answer that?
Oh my God. Okay. I mean, this is just free association sort of thing, but I mean, I think it's that I'm human, that I'm American, and that I'm a member of my family. Those are the three.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's an interesting hierarchy.
Yeah. Well, that's not in order. It's just those are the three.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. I would have to think about mine. I don't know what are the core aspects of my identity. I've lived roughly similar amounts of time across, Russia, UK, US, and then Berlin most recently.
Yeah.
Slightly more time in the UK and the US. But so nationally, I mean, I'm a citizen of the UK and the US. So that's interesting, I guess. But I have varying feelings about these places. But I almost feel like my identity is more shaped by the groups that I feel like I'm a part of. But it's hard to really nail that down. So anyway, I would have to think about it more. Cool. Let's touch on this idea of mutual vulnerability that you talk about in the piece and that you and I have spoken about in person as well, because I think that's a really good stepping stone into money.
Yeah. If you look at these other sorts of ways of thinking about what constitutes a community, like the associative obligations idea, which I think is also, there's a lot of ways of languaging these things. Like my friend Margaret Levy has done some really great writing on the idea of communities of shared fate, which is, I think, sort of a related idea. We've also got the idea of Dewey in publics. We've got some of these ideas about, communities sort of defining themselves through shared secret information. If we look at all these different ways of understanding like what constitutes a community, one of the sort of common threads that emerges for me is the idea of mutual vulnerability. So in other words, in one way or another, it seems to me that in most rich, genuine communal structures, there is a sense of people being vulnerable to each other. In other words, a sense of people, you can just think about the idea of like unlocked doors or something like that. The idea that people are able to live with or be comfortable with the fact that they could be harmed by another member of the community. In the case of the sort of secret information thing, it's like, well, anyone could tell the secrets to others. This would undermine the community. This would hurt everyone individually. It would undermine the community. In the case of, Dewey in publics, it's like coordination is necessary, right? I mean, if people don't coordinate around solving the problem, then the problem won't get solved. So there's, in that sense, everyone's vulnerable to one another. If everyone acts individualistically to try to solve the pollution problem, then the pollution problem won't get solved. People will just put air filters in their apartments or whatever. It's the same with associative obligations. So what I did some thinking about is, and I get this is a little bit of a transition to the sort of money experiment and, community currency experiments. But in connection with some of our community currency work, I started thinking about like how to create sort of contained, safe, miniature versions of this pattern, of this mutual vulnerability pattern. It seems to me that if you can figure out how to do that in a safe and contained way, you're building one of these basic layers of a genuine community, right? It's kind of a dual aspect thing, right? Because if people are willing to enter into a state of mutual vulnerability with other people, I mean, first of all, that's like a foundation upon which, the deepening of communal connection could grow. And it's also sort of like a test for whether there is some pre-existing trust, some pre-existing communal connection there. I just want to make clear that I'm like sort of acutely aware that this pattern of mutual vulnerability is very, very abusable. And it actually is very often abused by people who are trying to manipulate groups and stuff. So, for example, I mean, if you can kind of induce people to be really vulnerable to each other, it can be a super dark and manipulative aspect to encouraging people into these kinds of patterns. Precisely because I'm aware of that, like the way that, the way that I think about it is very much like how to do this in really safe boxes, like really safe and transparent boxes. So like basically so that everyone understands what we're doing. Like we're not, and the way that manifests itself in our community currency experiment is like super simple. Let's say everyone takes $20, right? An amount of money it's a real amount of money. It's a little bit more than just a complete token, but it's also not a huge amount of money. It's not an amount of money that is creating any sort of really deep or dangerous dependency or encouraging people to go farther than they might feel comfortable with, right? It's a very sort of just barely more than symbolic amount of money is the way that I think about it. Let's say we each take $20. We put $20 in a pot between us. And the rule of the game is that everybody can take out more than just the $20 they put in. So we're all trusting everyone else to respect the community by not doing. This is the ritual that is this sort of entry ritual into this community currency experiment that we started at Edge Esmeralda and will now bring to Edge Lana.
Well, let me touch on a couple of things there, and then we can actually dive into the money side of things. So I think there's an interesting parallel in this idea of mutual vulnerability to just normal relationships and friendships. And I think there's a very clear, strong correlation between how close you are with someone and how vulnerable you are to them. And if there's a truly meaningful connection, they know a lot about you. The people closest to us often have the most power to hurt us. And therefore, it's not that vulnerability is a byproduct of closeness of relationship. It is actually a causal factor there
Right.
as well, I think. And so abstracting that to the level of a community also makes sense. Again, you are close with people, and the closer you are with them or with your friend group, there are aspects, there are things you know about people, experiences you've gone through, etc., that bind you. And I think that's a very important point, because when people hear the word vulnerability, they might think, I don't really want to be in an environment where I'm vulnerable to someone else. Or, I think you touched on this. There is something important there that one needs to be really careful of, especially in community experiments. And that's why I actually just get a little bit nervous about some of these experiments that have almost like a figurehead and core idea that everyone needs to follow, especially when you get into things where people are like starting to live together and whatever. That can get, I think, a little dangerous. I think this is where plurality plays a very important part.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this idea of vulnerability and trust is very interlinked and very important. And what I'm hearing you saying with this experiment that you started to illustrate with this shared money pool is that we can essentially, now that we know that fact, that vulnerability is important, let's almost back into it and
Right.
let's create a system where we have vulnerability almost from the beginning. You're vulnerable to your part of this pot being taken out by someone. And so you need to do it with people that you trust, or it's a way to quickly build trust with people by going through this process.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of backing into the discussion of community currency here, but I think it actually works because, for example, one of the big problems that I'm interested in solving or mitigating when I think about community currencies is like community currencies don't work unless there's a community. Community currencies don't work unless people care about the community. If you don't care about the community, then you don't want a limited currency. If you don't care, you by default, people want the most universal currency possible. That's basically what currency is. You want currency to be something that stores value that you can take in as many places as possible. And the more universal it is, the more money-like it is, the more it's currency, the more desirable it is as traditional money. Now, there's a lot of really interesting problems that we could solve and things that we could do if we could get away from thinking about money in that traditional way, starting to think about it in more of a commuted, more bounded, community-focused way. But in order to do that, we need to get away from our attraction to this sort of universal store of value thing. And a prerequisite to that is that you got to care about the community. You got to care about the community in which the community currency has value.
So can you give some intuition around this? Like what actually happens if there is a community currency? What does it prevent? What is the problem that it's solving?
When you start to think about the idea of money as a maximally universal store of value, you can sort of see that what is going on with money is that it's enabling people to acquire value in one context or another, and then take that value into a different context. You earn money in city A, and the beauty of money is that you can take what you earned in city A and spend it in city B.
That sounds pretty great. What's wrong with that?
Nothing necessarily. But because that's what money is doing, because it's allowing value to come out of one context and go into another context, it has this function of sort of popping the balloon of every particular context. So if you want to create a particular context of economic value exchange and keep the attention and the energy of the people within that context on that context, then basically money is working against you. Right? Because money it's literally pulling the attention of all the economic actors within the context up to this universal level. So I'm thinking, if I'm in a community and I earn some money by providing services to the community, the fact that money is universal means that it pulls my attention away. I'm no longer thinking about how do I reinvest in this community. I'm thinking about how do I invest for maximum return anywhere in the world. So the more universal the money is, the less likely I am to reinvest it into the community where I earned it.
Interesting. So one of the important ideas of community currencies is essentially to act as a medium of exchange and a unit of account, and to some degree a store of value, which are the traditional ideas of money, but within a certain community context, and potentially to make it hard to exit that context, which then just means that more value is exchanged within that community. Is that the idea?
Yeah. I mean, you can think of it as it's about trying to hold energy into a system, like a combustion engine or like a pressurized container. In order to create an internal combustion engine or a balloon or any sort of a system that has an inside and an outside, including an economic system, you need to create some barrier around it, and money, just logically, conceptually, fundamentally, money is about crossing those barriers. It's about puncturing those containers and opening everything up, which, mirrors the conversation we were having earlier about how, like, sometimes escaping from a community is good. Sometimes getting out of an oppressive local cultural context, for example, is absolutely good. And that's the same is true with money. I mean, you get gains from trade and global efficiency and all these kinds of things. It can do many good things, but I think we sometimes forget that it's also preventing us from doing this other thing, which is to build, more local, more bounded contexts of value exchange.
If I was to try and argue against that, I would say something along the lines of, it's actually quite beautiful, this idea of universal currency, because it allows global collaboration. It just removes those barriers. It brings the diversity of the world to everyone in some way. There's like a universal medium of exchange, which is really profound and very cool.
Yeah.
But at the same time, also makes it very difficult for local communities to remain coherent, because there's always an exit path, right? Like if you make it big in a small town, you can just leave and buy a mansion in New York or something, or maybe that's a bad example, but there's kind of this interesting parallel of like, the globalized nature of our world is such a cool thing. And at the same time, it has made the process of actually maintaining local communities very difficult.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's a subtle point, but it's important to see how these things are not actually necessarily in tension with one another. Like what's beautiful about like global exchange and being in contact with the sum total of economic actors in the world, which is what's going on when you have universal money. What's beautiful about that is that it's enabling us to experience diversity, right? It's enabling us to connect with, trade with, interact with different people, different cultures, right? But nothing is costless. And in doing that, we also actually erode the difference. We erode the difference. So, like diversity is almost it's like a resource that you can mine, and it creates incredible value and incredible beauty, but you can also overdo it and create a situation in which there actually just isn't any difference. So the idea of creating more textured economic structures where you've got, more local, more mid-sized kind of internality and externality and lasting contexts of exchange that kind of maintain their integrity, over time. The more you have that, the more diversity there is to be gotten from like global exchange. So it's about like sort of the sustainable, it's like sustainable fisheries or something like that, right? I mean, like if we want diversity to continue to exist in the world, we need to make sure that we're not like overfishing.
And there's not essentially what you're saying is like the world to some degree is just homogenizing, right? Like the world of business is kind of the same everywhere now. And that's not that interesting, right? Like we want there to still be pockets of interesting local things going on. And I don't necessarily mean geographically local. I mean local in the sense that it could be people from all over that are grouped by some interest, but like we want them to have a boundary around themselves, be able to create the thing that they're doing, and then interact with other communities.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, part of the intuition of, trying to sort of strengthen our cultural muscle around community currency and, local economy and these kinds of things is, I mean, I just think, an important context to see it in, I suppose, is that there are lots of other ways of creating barriers, and maintaining difference, erecting walls, and, these kinds of things. So in other words, like through, I don't know, national politics, people can do similar kinds of things, right? People can use politics and violence and other kinds of things to maintain these differences. And that obviously, has its place. It has its dark side. But I think that the idea of trying to maintain diversity and texture, even within economics, even just within economic systems, is like an important complement to that, right? Because if we, otherwise, it's like we don't want economics to just be this kind of like, complete leveling force and then rely on sort of dysfunctional politics to maintain diversity, right? It's like, why don't we start to think about, economic systems that actually don't just go sort of all the way to 11 in their cultural leveling and, decontextualizing.
But so I think something that's coming into view here is almost a world where there are obviously global currencies or kind of global mediums of exchange.
Yeah.
And then there are different levels of currency systems at different scales. So obviously to some degree, every country has a community currency now, or most do, and they have their own policies for those, etc. And that makes sense, I think. And that's kind of an intuition that people can take. It's like, well, what about if we just go one level lower, and then there are city currencies, and then one level lower, and there's like a neighborhood currency, or for example,
Right.
an edge city currency, right?
Right.
And
Or current, I think it's also just important in people's imagination that it doesn't have to be geographic, right? You can
right,
have
right, right, right.
non-geographic, localities with currencies.
But I guess I know this has been tried before,
Yeah.
but I'm curious if you can talk about maybe one or two examples and what we can learn from those in terms of feasibility and what's interesting here.
Yeah. So there's a very, very long history of experimentation with community currencies. Many idealistic people for centuries have thought that, the creation of more local currencies would enable, not only communities to maintain their integrity against more powerful outside economic actors or whatever, but also just for communities to, to empower themselves, to encourage more internal exchange so that they would solve their own problems, these kinds of things. If you look at like the long arc of the history of community currencies, you see an uphill battle. Like you see mostly failure. Why? Let's put that into context. People prefer global currency. People prefer universal currency for reasons that I already kind of touched on, right? Everybody would like, if you imagine a local currency that has like a certain exchange rate to the dollar, it's like, I don't know, 2 local bucks per dollar or whatever. You will not want to hold that local currency at all, ever. You will just want to sell it for a dollar. Why? Because presumably expectations about whether the local currency or the dollar is going to appreciate are already baked into the price, right? So it's always preferable just exchange the local currency that you can spend in fewer places for a global currency that you can spend in more places. It's like something for nothing. So you'd always rather make that exchange. Modern history, even pre-modern history sort of shows like a steady march towards more and more universal stores of value, like gold and most recently the dollar, and that's the direction that the wind blows economically. You have to find ways of sustaining community currencies.
And what is so maybe is there one example we can look at, or maybe a couple of like people that have tried this and maybe it didn't quite work out?
Well, I think one really interesting example from fairly recent history is a project called Berkshires, which was a community currency, basically was mostly used by like local businesses in Western Massachusetts in the past couple of decades. My understanding is that Berkshires is like largely defunct now. It had a few years of pretty notable success, but it just kind of gradually tapered off. I think it had some success for a while because people were really motivated in that region to create local economy, right? So in other words, people in that part of Massachusetts feel a lot of local pride. They feel a lot of a local connection. And the idea of kind of creating a self-standing economic system there just resonated with people. So people were motivated to use Berkshires and to accept Berkshires. And I think there's, part of the story is a success story, right? I think it's important to see that too. But it didn't last. And the reason it didn't last, I think, is what I just said, that over the long run, people would just rather not hold local currencies, which means that there's like a downward, there's headwinds on the value of it. And that's it. One important point to make is that a lot of people who create local currency systems are really, really, really motivated by the desire for the local currency system to enrich the local currency in global money terms, right? So everybody wants to be able to tell the story that we're going to create a local currency, and through the use of our local currency, we're all going to get richer in dollars. Like people constantly want to tell that story because it's a great story. You want to empower community, right? And Berkshire's was like that. So it was like easy to exchange Berkshires for dollars. And I'm not sure. I think they might have had like a pegged rate or something. So it was made in such a way that it was encouraged and easy for people to exchange their Berkshires for dollars. I think that's a mistake. I think that's kind of a misconception of it's sort of like the wrong way of directing a community to think about its own currency. It's important, I think, for people to see the use of the local currency as, in a way, like a sacrifice for the community. So in other words, holding the currency is not, if you want dollars, use dollars, right? If people are buying the local currency or using the local currency because they are trying to find the fastest route from A to Z, where Z is more dollars in my pocket, then it doesn't work. It has to be understood as an investment in the economic health of the community itself, potentially at the expense of the number of dollars in your pocket.
But what are some of the things that someone can do with a community currency? Let's say we have one. Like, what could someone do with Berkshires, just to make that really clear for people?
Yeah, I mean, you could go to the ice cream shop in North Adams, Massachusetts, and buy ice cream, or rent a bike, or this kind of. It was local business type transactions, which you could pay in Berkshires,
Cool.
which they actually printed out notes and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so let's paint a picture for what it would feel like to be in a community where this fundamental problem that you've illustrated is fixed. And just to summarize it back to you, essentially with community currencies, there's always a problem when exit is free out of the system, because there is a liquidity premium on the universal currency, in this case dollars, where everyone would rather just have dollars. But let's say there was a way, spoiler alert, if things are on chain, you can kind of mandate things. But let's say there was a way that you would have to pay a discount if you wanted to exit the community, right? What does that world look like? What does that community look like and feel like? What do they get from having this system?
They get a few things. First, the community can internally use its own currency to buy goods and services from one another. The thing to notice is that, like, if people are holding a local currency, then because they're holding a local currency, they're going to sort of like look to the local community. They're going to see like, well, what kinds of goods and services can I get in this community? They'll think that because they've got some of the local currency. So they're not, they won't just like cruise Amazon to find, X, Y, or Z. They'll think about, what the local community offers them. They'll also, again, if they're motivated to get the local currency and correctly understanding that supporting the local currency system is good for the community, then they'll think about what they can provide, to the local community. They'll think like, in this context, within this group of people, within this circle, what can I do that people will value? So it almost kind of like brings you back closer to that, idealized picture of markets where people are like thinking about one another's interests and trying to address them. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is that if this, if the community uses this internally circulating currency to deepen its own collaboration, gets kind of a meaningful internal economy going, then the community as a whole is actually very dramatically empowered, quite interestingly. This is a hugely important part of the story to see. And so here's why that's true. Because if we create an internal group where people are providing high value goods and services to each other in exchange for monopoly bucks, right? Then suddenly people outside the community are going to want those monopoly bucks. So you're going to think, wow, like, maybe it's like a group of great engineers or something. People outside the community are thinking, my gosh, if I had some of those monopoly bucks, I could get some of the time of some of these brilliant people in this super community of engineers or something like that, right? And so now the community as a whole can empower itself by like leveraging the external world's demand for those services. One way of doing that is to print money, right? You can print some more of the internal community currency and sell it to people in the outside world. Sell it for real dollars. Take those real dollars and invest them in real things that become like, a shared trust for the community. So if you can actually get the internal currency going, then it's not, you've done more than create an internal currency. You've done more than create internal exchange. You've also created a central bank for yourself, which can use its power to empower the community vis-a-vis the external world using real dollars and real assets.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I feel like one of my questions is why now? And I guess if I had to answer, I imagine blockchain unlocks a lot here, but partly just because of proof of identity and transparency and things like that. But partly because I feel like we just have a lot of the building blocks now to run meaningful experiments like this. Or maybe I'm just, I have a hammer and looking for a nail, but is that like a fair comment to make there?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that there's no doubt that blockchain lets us experiment with currency systems. It lets us build like rule-based currency systems. And that is fun and interesting. And that's part of the reason why, this work is going on. But I think there are also other reasons, like sort of non-technological reasons why I think this kind of idea makes sense now, just culturally. Like I think that these kinds of problems, like the sort of, the problem of like erosion of local community and local context by, it's not new, but it comes into clearer focus every day. And similarly, I think when people sort of lose confidence in traditional political institution X, Y, or Z, to sort of create a insulating bubble around their cultural context against the sort of forces of universal money, people start to think about other ways of doing that. People think, how can we create, different kinds of systems that will maintain diversity, that will maintain community, that will allow us to, to exist without being sort of, standing naked in the hurricane, as it were, right? Which is, a bit, it's a silly metaphor, but that's something that comes to mind to me when I think about like, an individual human engaging with the global market. It's like, you're too small and it's too big. We need things that either make us a little bigger or make the market that we're engaging with a little smaller. And that's what community currencies are trying to do.
Yeah, a lot of interesting ideas there. So RadicalxChange ran a community currency experiment at Esmeralda, which was a pop-up village that we did with Edge City in June of this year. And you created a community currency called Edges. I'm curious if you can just very quickly outline how it worked. And then now with a few months of retrospection, plus this new experiment that you're about to run at our next pop-up village, Edge City Lana, what your thoughts are on this experiment.
Yeah. So the way that Edges worked at Edge Esmeralda was you could sort of join Edges by going through that ritual that I described earlier. Literally take $20 and put it in a box. And with the understanding that everyone who has put $20 in that box has the ability to go back to that box and take out more than their $20. There's some sort of kinks that make it a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the general principle. So then you do that. You put in $20. You get 100 edges. With the 100 edges, you can just basically use a very simple app to send them to other people. You can send them to other people who have sort of joined Edges by going through that entry ritual, or you can send them to people outside of the Edges network by just putting in their email and sending it to them that way. The other important kink in the system is the idea of an exit tax. So this goes to that idea that we were discussing a moment ago about creating sort of a barrier, creating a disincentive for pulling value out of the local context. The idea of an exit tax is essentially that if you want to swap your edges for dollars, let's say, which you might do by simply sending your edges to someone outside of the system and getting dollars back, you have to pay a tax to do that. Whereas if you send edges to other people within the system, like in exchange for their services or something like that, it's untaxed. So the idea is to, sort of tilt people towards using the edges to exchange services or engage in, collaboration with one another, tilt them against cashing it out. There are some other sort of like rules about, when you have to pay an exit tax and when you don't, which get a little bit more complicated and in some cases require like good faith between the users. And that's actually another reason for the mutual vulnerability thing, because part of the idea here is that we're not creating a bulletproof, unhackable system, right? We're creating a communal resource that will only work as well as people use it in good faith.
Yep.
So starting off the kind of community by asking people to trust one another a little bit, creating this, sort of slightly ritualized trust thing is a way of letting people know that, look, if you want to try to break it, if you want to try to hack the system, this is not for you. please go elsewhere. What we're trying to do here is to create a group of people who are interested in using this tool to collaborate with one another, potentially create not only an internal economy, but a community that can sustain itself, that can help do good things for its members.
Yeah, I think that it was very cool for me to see people start to actually interact, people get really involved and send edges around to each other, have, do favors for each other. There was kind of a discovery process of like, wait, how much is this worth? How much is that worth? It was cool that people started to engage with it in good faith and good fun. Like one of the things I'm still thinking about when considering introducing something like this into the community is that, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I feel like when you try to financialize interactions within a community, that potentially is a little bit icky for people, especially if it's in, or if there's like a small friend group and you don't really want to start charging people tokens for, doing you favors and stuff. So I'm curious where that line is and how you think about like having really local, almost, business activity based on these things.
Yeah. So first of all, I totally agree with all that. And actually, I think that like the sort of like financializing goodwill transactions and social things is actually that is like a failure mode for edges, I think. Like, so if that's what edges does, then it's like, we missed. The way to think about this work is it's very much in the context of like sort of what I was talking about before about how we've got institutions that are sort of we've got institutions that are individualistic, institutions that are like very close in to the individual. We've also got institutions that are like very global, and we don't have enough institutions that are in that intermediate level. And we don't have enough institutions that are like finding that space between that sort of meso level of social organization. So Edges is trying to target that sort of meso level of social organization. What that means is that things that are happening closer to home, interactions between friends and doing favors for people that you just want to do a favor for, there's no reason to introduce Edges into those, really. There's no reason to financialize things that are already working well on a non-financialized basis. But there is like a layer of activity and a layer in collaboration that sits just above that I really want Edges to encourage. And what that is it's kind of like, it's like collaboration that goes a bit beyond just what I would do as a favor, but is not yet at the level of sort of global mercenariness of accepting a contract. So there's something in between there. The intuition is that, for example, within your community, like think about just where you live or something like that. Within your community, there are things that you could be collaborating with your neighbors on, let's say, that you're not collaborating with your neighbors on because it doesn't make sense for because your neighbors aren't paying enough for you to do that kind of thing. But it's also like too much to ask just for nothing. So the idea of community currency is to like find that in between, find that sort of gap. And if it works, it will enable people to build shared projects that go, deeper than what could be done with people just doing favors for each other, but are like more meaningful and more community oriented than what would emerge if people are, just paying each other in dollars.
Yeah, I think that's a cool vision. And I can kind of intuitively see it where it's almost like people on maybe opposite sides of the Edge City community, maybe people who have not met yet, but could find ways to collaborate with this shared substrate of value, knowing that, if they get whatever 500 edges, they can spend that on like a discount on the next event or something like that. Right. So yeah, I could see ways of crafting the system that allows for that kind of interaction to happen. I wonder if we can come up with like one or two actual examples of this meso level of collaboration, because I think we're right there. It's almost clear to me, like a concrete thing,
So, I mean, one thing that I think is definitely an area of opportunity is people building like community infrastructure. So, people are building software for the Edge City community or something like that, right? That's the perfect thing that I would love for Edges to accelerate. Because like to a certain extent, some people are going to be motivated to like volunteer on that kind of thing. And, to a certain extent, it might make sense to, find some real money to pay some people to help out with that kind of thing. But there's a gap in between there. There's like sort of like a place where you can ask community members to go a little bit beyond their goodwill, but not go completely to this sort of market mercenary mentality to help out with things, right? To build software, for example, or to volunteer with the community itself. Like, for example, at pop-up villages, there are lots and lots of hands-on jobs that need to get done. And there's a lot of goodwill in the community, so you can kind of fill a lot of that with volunteers. But sometimes the volunteers may not be quite as forthcoming as you want them to be, and so that's exactly where you can sort of sense that entering that meso layer, right? Entering that space where community currency could do something that goodwill isn't quite doing, and that would be better not to do with like dollars or ETH.
Yeah, really cool. And just to tie it back to what we were talking about at the beginning, this is the culmination, I feel like, of the conversation, because I wanted to touch on new community ideas, then using those as places for experimentation, then what makes a community good, and things like mutual vulnerability, which leads neatly into this community currency idea, and back to how can we use these pop-up villages, which is the flavor of new community experiment that I'm working on, as a place for actual meaningful experimentation of new ideas and institutions, ways of living, etc. And so from that lens, I'm curious what your view is on all of this, on this new movement, this kind of pop-up village experiment. Where does it sit in the lineage of similar ideas and thinking that has come thus far?
Yeah, I mean, this is just one of these things where all I can do is kind of give my own take, or I don't have any authoritative interpretation here, but I sort of see it as an attempt to take some of the individualist escaper cultural phenomena that we see in tech and in crypto and in kind of associated spaces, and a little bit sort of tie it back in with a spirit of responsible experimentation and thoughtful attempt to create non-escapist new institutions. So it's like an evolving phenomenon. So I mean, I think it's hard to say what it will evolve into in a few years, but I think if you look at like the last couple of years of it, that's kind of what I see. I sort of see it as like a attempt to make a slightly less individualistic or more integrated or more like genuinely community oriented network of collaborators. Like, I guess I'm not quite being specific enough. Like, it's kind of a response to the network state phenomenon, I think, right? It's sort of like taking some of what's interesting about the network state phenomenon and trying to weave it into thoughtful community building instead of just making it about sort of financial escape, right? I think it plays an important role for a lot of people who are doing the digital nomad thing or are embedded in the tech world in a way that leaves them like somewhat disconnected from like other cultural spheres, right? And are kind of like looking for a little bit more connection, a little bit more intentional community building. I think that like pop-up cities movement is playing a really important and positive role in weaving communities where it's needed. There's also Michel Bowens gave a really good talk at Esmeralda, where he was sort of comparing the phenomenon to like the emergence of monasteries in the Middle Ages after the Roman Empire began to collapse, which I think is, there's a lot, there's a lot of, the disanalogies there are too numerous to count. Nonetheless, it's an interesting analogy because there is certainly true that we're in kind of a weird cultural moment in which many people feel sort of not satisfied or not sufficiently supported by the communities around them, right? I mean, go back to Putnam and Bowling Alone and all that kind of thing. I mean, there's a lot of like NOV out there in modern world, and I think we're all in this journey of trying to figure out how to respond to that, how to not give in to that. And I think that the pop-up cities movement is like a really interesting and chapter in that story.
Yeah, well said. Well, I think I have just one more question to end it out, a bit of a tangent, but I'm curious so we think a lot about this idea of human flourishing, and I'm curious what human flourishing means to you, or to put another way, what do you feel like is important in living a good life, a happy life? What does well-being mean to you personally? And also maybe at like a societal scale.
I was talking to my therapist actually about like sort of, what are like the problems that sort of ground out your sense of purpose sort of thing. So we were talking about, the environment. I mean, there's all these like huge problems in the world, right? Like the ecological crisis and where are we going with technology and, politics. But I think like the dimension of thriving that just attracts me, that makes me feel like I'm doing something that matters. It makes me feel least like I'm sort of casting my energies up against unsolvably huge problems is like this sort of human connection thing. Like I think that kind of, creating like social experiences and social connections by which people can actually solve one another's material problems and or need for human connection. That just feels tractable to me. That feels like something I can do. And all these other things are real too, like saving the oceans, it's all real. But the sort of human thing, the sort of like recognize the other humans and what can you do for them? That is what most satisfies me. And that is where I believe that's what I feel like I should be doing in order to like advance my own thriving and other people's thriving.
Yeah. Well, I think we're very aligned in that. And I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you.